The aroma was rich, but death lingered beneath the foam. Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. Tell me where you're tuning in from. I love seeing our mystery circle grow. Your comments make this journey unforgettable. Let's begin. If there's one thing that can crack Nero Wolfe's composure before 11 in the morning, it's tampering with his breakfast routine. He can forgive the collapse of an empire, but not a delay in his eggs. That Wednesday started with the smell of Mocha, thick, fragrant, and slightly darker than usual. Fritz had outdone himself, whisking the cream until it flirted with perfection. I was halfway through my second cup when Wolfe raised one of his imperial eyebrows. That was the first tremor. "Archie," he said, the name landing like a summons, "this coffee is adulterated." Now, in most homes, that kind of accusation would earn a blank stare. In Wolfe's brownstone, it was akin to saying there's blood on the Pope's slippers. I tasted the coffee again. It was rich, complex, and, yes, maybe a hair off. "Adulterated?" I repeated. "If you mean Fritz used last week's beans, I'll volunteer for execution." He put down the cup, his lips flattening. "Fritz does not err. Someone has tampered." Before I could make the obvious wisecrack, something about coffee espionage, the doorbell rang. Fritz, still red-faced from the insult to his sanctum, went to answer it. Moments later, he returned with a woman whose arrival turned the morning from sour to suspicious. She was in her 40s, tall, deliberate in her movements, and carrying an air that could have belonged to a headmistress or a duchess. Her eyes went straight to Wolfe's, then flicked to me with polite disregard. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, "my name is Lucinda Halpern. I need your help. Urgently." Wolfe made a sound that might have been a sigh or indigestion. "Madame," he murmured, "I do not receive clients before 10, and never during breakfast." She didn't budge. "You will receive me now, Mr. Wolfe. Someone has tried to poison me." That got his attention. Wolfe's eyelids rose a millimeter, which in his language was a scream. I leaned forward. "And you think it's the same blend we're drinking?" "I don't think," she said. "I know. I sent this coffee to you last night as a gift from my husband's company. It was meant as thanks for your review of his gourmet import line. I received my own batch. An hour later, he was dead." Wolfe stared at her, his great head sinking into his shoulders like a turtle assessing a snake. "Pfui," he said softly. "Archie, stop drinking that." I put my cup down. I wasn't feeling faint yet, but Wolfe's tone had a way of draining the flavor out of anything. He turned to Lucinda Halpern. "Madam, you claim your husband was killed by coffee, and you bring his poison to my table." Her chin lifted. "I brought it because I believed the killer meant to kill me. My husband only drank it first." Wolfe's eyes shut halfway. He reached for a napkin, dabbed his lips, and said, "Mrs. Halpern, you have disturbed my breakfast. You had better make it worth the intrusion. Sit. Archie, the coffee. Dispose of it carefully. We may need it again." And just like that, breakfast became evidence. I carried the cup into the kitchen as if it were nitroglycerin, which, for all I knew, it might as well have been. Fritz was hovering by the stove, a picture of culinary outrage, his mustache bristling. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his accent sharpening like a knife on a whetstone, "I swear on my honor, that coffee—" "Relax, Fritz," I cut in. "Wolfe doesn't suspect you. He suspects the universe, which is worse, but at least you're off the hook." He exhaled through his nose like a disappointed bull. I poured the remainder of my cup into a glass jar, sealed it, and labeled it, "Do not drink unless you hate yourself." Then I stuck it in the refrigerator. Wolfe might want it later for analysis, or possibly to terrify a suspect. By the time I returned to the office, Lucinda Halpern had seated herself opposite Wolfe. She was perched on the edge of the red leather chair, her gloved hands tight around her handbag as if it might escape. Wolfe, meanwhile, was reclined in his throne of an armchair, fingertips together, the faintest gleam of interest in his eyes. The same gleam a cat gives a new bird in the yard. "I will require clarity, Mrs. Halpern," he said. "Start at the beginning and refrain from dramatization. When, precisely, did your husband die?" "Last night, around 9. We had dinner together at home. He poured the coffee himself from the new shipment, Mocha Royal, his company's latest blend. We'd both had a cup when he collapsed. By the time the doctor arrived, he was gone." Her voice held together, but only just. Wolfe's gaze didn't soften. "Cause?" "Cyanide. The coroner confirmed it this morning. They think it was introduced after roasting, perhaps through the packaging. My husband handled that himself to approve the first distribution batch." "And you drank the same coffee?" "Yes," she said, "but my cup was half finished when it happened. I dropped it." Wolfe's eyelids lowered. "Fortunate," she nodded. "I thought so, until I realized something was wrong with the batch. The police took samples, of course, but I sent a sealed tin to you yesterday morning before dinner. It arrived by courier." I could practically hear the gears turning in Wolfe's mind. He didn't move, but the air in the room felt denser. "So," he murmured, "a poisoned shipment sent to a food critic and the manufacturer himself. That is either coincidence of astonishing design or intent most deliberate." Lucinda drew a sharp breath. "Mr. Wolfe, I am not concerned with coincidence. My husband's company has competitors, enemies, but someone wanted this to look random. I know the police will dismiss it as an industrial accident, but you won't." He gave her one of his rare smiles, the kind that didn't reach his eyes. "You are correct, madam. I do not dismiss anything." I leaned against the wall, watching her. "What kind of business are we talking about?" "Specialty imports, coffee, teas, spices. Halpern and Klein. My husband founded it with his partner, Edwin Klein. We've been expanding rapidly these past 2 years. Too rapidly, perhaps." "Partners don't always share the same appetite for growth," I said. She shot me a look that might have been approval or irritation. "No, they don't. Edwin believed my husband was reckless. He also stood to lose control of the company if Daniel, my husband, finalized his new contracts in South America. There were arguments." Wolfe murmured, "Money and ego, an inexhaustible brew." He gestured slightly toward me. "Archie, telephone Inspector Kramer. Inquire whether he has acquainted himself with the death of Daniel Halpern." I went to the desk, dialed, and after the usual static of gruffness and suspicion, Kramer came on the line. When I mentioned Wolfe's name, I could hear him biting his cigar. "Goodwin, tell your boss to stay out of this. It's a straight-up accidental contamination. We've got the state lab on it." "Sure, Inspector. He'll stay out," I said, because lying to Kramer before breakfast is one of my lesser sins. "Just so you know, the widow's sitting in our office right now, sipping unpoisoned air and claiming attempted murder." There was a pause, then a grunt. "Of course she is." "Fine. Tell Wolfe not to mess with the evidence, and for the love of decency, don't let him start one of his demonstrations." "I'll pin him to his chair if I have to," I promised, and hung up. When I relayed the message, Wolfe simply said, "As if I ever leave the chair." Lucinda gave a weak smile. "Then you'll help me." "I will consider it," he said, which in Wolfen meant he already had. "First, we must isolate the facts. The coffee you sent me, where was it before shipment?" "It was packaged yesterday morning at the plant. My husband inspected that particular tin himself. So he handled it, and you sent it. Did anyone else have access?" "Only the staff. The line supervisor, a man named Kerrigan, and perhaps Edwin. He was there that morning for a meeting." Wolfe's nostrils flared slightly. "Then it will be convenient if Mr. Goodwin visits this plant today. He will inquire about procedures, personnel, and any irregularities." Lucinda opened her handbag, produced a card, and slid it across the desk. "Here's the address. I'll notify them you're coming." "Do not," Wolfe said sharply. "Surprise is a solvent. It clarifies truth." She hesitated, then nodded. When she left 15 minutes later, Wolfe sat in silence, staring at the mocha-colored stain her glove had left on the arm of the chair. Fritz came in to clear the tray, looking like a man handling relics. I finally broke the quiet. "So, boss, you think she's telling the truth?" "I think," Wolfe said, "that she is frightened. Whether by guilt's proximity, or the specter of her husband's partner, I do not yet know." He reached for his beer, though it was only 10:30. "Attend the factory, Archie. See what you may pry loose. Observe Klein if you can, and for heaven's sake avoid drinking anything offered." I nodded. "I'll pack a flask." He closed his eyes, retreating into that silent fortress he calls thinking. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the hall seemed louder. Outside, the city was waking, ordinary and oblivious. Inside the brownstone, though, something had shifted. A ripple in Wolfe's ordered world. When I stepped out into the October chill, I knew one thing. Whatever had been in that mocha cup, it wasn't just poison. It was bait. And Nero Wolfe had already swallowed it. Intellect first. The Halpin and Klein Import Company was tucked between a paper wholesaler and a warehouse that smelled like old burlap and secrets. The place looked like it had been built when steamships still ruled the seas. Brick walls, soot-stained from a century of ambition. Windows too narrow for comfort and too high for honesty. A green and gold sign over the front read, "Halpin and Klein's Specialty Imports, Esther 1912. It had the confidence of something that believed its own advertisements. Inside, the air was heavy with the perfume of roasted beans, cinnamon, and the faint industrial undertone of solvents. You don't often smell ambition, but here it was brewed by the ton. A woman at the front desk was typing with the grim precision of someone who hated every letter she produced. I gave her my best professional grin. "Good morning, Archie Goodwin, Nero Wolfe's office. I'd like to see Mr. Edwin Klein." Her fingers froze mid-stroke. "Mr. Klein's in the blending room. You'll have to wait." "Not if I walk fast," I said, and started down the hall before she could object. The blending room was a cavern of steel drums, burlap sacks, and a half-dozen men in aprons who looked like they were auditioning for Les Miserables. The coffee edition. I spotted Klein right away, tall, angular, and dressed like a funeral director who had lost his way into a factory. He had that polished look of a man who'd spent a lifetime explaining things to people too stupid to understand him. "Mr. Klein?" I said. "Archie Goodwin from Nero Wolfe's office. I'm here about Daniel Halpin." He turned, his expression tightening before he managed a thin smile. "So the widow has already enlisted Mr. Wolfe's talents. I suppose I shouldn't be surprised." "That's one way of putting it," I said. "She thinks her husband's death wasn't an accident." "Of course she does. Lucinda thrives on drama, always has." He turned away, signaling I was dismissed. That was his first mistake. "Yeah, but poison tends to spoil the coffee no matter who's drinking it. You were at the plant yesterday morning, right?" He paused, one hand resting on a copper bin. "Yes, Daniel wanted to oversee the first sealed batch himself. I told him to let the supervisor handle it, but Daniel was possessive. Everything had to pass under his eye. Which means anyone in this room could have slipped something in while he wasn't looking." Klein's eyes flicked toward me, quick, cold, and very clear. "You're implying one of my employees committed murder." "I'm implying somebody did. Whether they worked here, visited, or just liked to sabotage breakfast, I don't know yet." He studied me for a second longer than comfort allows, then smiled faintly. "You can talk to the staff if you like. But you'll find no villains here, Mr. Goodwin, only loyal men doing their work. That's what they say in every prison cafeteria." His lips tightened again. I'd like to think Nero Wolfe would have chosen a subtler representative. I'd like to think he had, I said pleasantly, and went to find the line supervisor. The man in charge, Kerrigan, was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the kind of calloused hands that didn't type memos. His handshake was strong enough to count as a misdemeanor. "Yes, I was here when Mr. Halpern inspected the Mocha shipment," he said. "He took one of the tins himself, the one for his home, checked the seal, said he'd deliver it to Mrs. Halpern after work. That was the last I saw him." "Who else was around?" "Just the packaging crew, me, a kid named Billy, and the quality tester, Miss Dora Ellman. Oh, and Mr. Klein came in for a few minutes to argue about the new import invoice. Typical day." "Anything unusual happen?" Kerrigan scratched his chin. "Unusual? You mean besides the boss dropping dead last night?" "No, sir." He seemed sincere, but sincerity is the cheapest flavor in the human catalogue. I poked around the room, noting the layout. Each tin was filled, sealed, and labeled on a conveyor system that would have impressed Henry Ford. Everything looked clean, professional, and as innocent as arsenic powder in a sugar jar. Miss Dora Ellman turned out to be the only person who didn't avoid eye contact. She was young, mid-20s, serious brown eyes under a fringe of hair that looked perpetually wind-tossed. When I introduced myself, she didn't ask why I was there. "You think someone poisoned the coffee?" she said flatly. "I think Mr. Wolfe will want to find out who," I replied. "You're the quality tester. Would you notice if something was added?" "If it affected the aroma, yes. But cyanide, it evaporates quickly. A trace could hide under the stronger notes. Still," she hesitated. "There was something odd. Mr. Halpern insisted on testing the Mocha himself. He took a small jar from his pocket, said it was a private sample. It wasn't from our batch." My eyebrows went up. "You're sure about that?" "Yes, it had a different label. When I asked, he said he was comparing flavors. He brewed a little in the tasting room. That's the last I saw of it." "Interesting. And who else was in there with him?" "Mr. Klein came in for a few minutes. They argued, quietly, but it was tense. Then Mr. Klein left. Mr. Halpern finished the sample, sealed the tin for home, and said something about sending another to a critic he admired. That must have been Mr. Wolfe. That stitched the pattern tighter. I thanked her and left my card, telling her to call if she remembered anything else. Outside, the autumn light had the thin, golden edge that makes you feel like time's running faster than usual. I called Wolfe from the payphone at the corner. He answered on the third ring. "Report," he said, as if he'd been timing me. "Klein looks like a man who could strangle a conscience and sleep well. The supervisor's clean. There's a lab girl who noticed something. Halpern had a private sample he was testing, not from their batch. He argued with Klein right before leaving." A pause. Did she describe the jar?" "Small, glass, hand-labeled. She didn't read it." "Then," Wolfe said, "we have two mysteries. Who poisoned the public shipment, and what precisely Mr. Halpern introduced to his own cup. The latter may explain the former." "Want me to bring the girl over?" "Not yet. Return here. Bring the tin you preserved, and Archie, avoid publicity. I do not wish to read our breakfast in the evening edition." When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was still in his chair, the remains of lunch perfuming the air. Corn cakes and trout, if I wasn't mistaken. He listened without interruption as I laid it all out. When I was done, he leaned back, eyes half shut. "It is possible," he said slowly, "that Mr. Halpern poisoned himself." That one hung in the air like a bad odor. "You mean by accident?" I asked. "Perhaps. Or he tested something illicit. An experimental blend, a rival's concoction. A man's vanity often poisons him faster than arsenic." He reached for the sealed jar I'd brought from the fridge. "Archie, fetch Saul Panzer. I require discretion and an eye sharper than yours for trails." There is more here than caffeine and misfortune. I raised an eyebrow. You planning to leave your chair for this one? He snorted. I am not a bloodhound. My role is to think. Yours is to walk. I started for the phone, then stopped. One more thing, boss. Mrs. Halpern said the coffee shipment was a gift of gratitude to you. If it was poisoned before it reached her husband, you might have been the intended target. Wolfe's lips curved in that infuriatingly calm smile. I'm aware. But anyone foolish enough to attempt my murder through cuisine has already declared intellectual bankruptcy. I do not forgive dullards, Archie. Find me a mind worth opposing. That was Wolfe, more offended by mediocrity than mortality. I went to make the call to Saul, already thinking ahead. Because if Nero Wolfe was bait, someone out there had just hooked a whale, and they didn't even know it yet. When Saul Panzer showed up that evening, he brought with him the quiet efficiency of a man who could tail a ghost and invoice it later. He came straight to the office, where Wolfe sat, massive and motionless, like a mountain that had decided to read the newspaper. The coffee tins sat on the desk between them, innocent and murderous. Saul nodded at me. Evening, Archie. I hear someone spiked the boss's breakfast. I grinned. You could say that. We're calling it the Mocha misunderstanding until further notice. Wolfe gestured toward the chair. Sit. I require your services. Mr. Halpern's partner, Edwin Klein, must be examined discreetly. Observe his movements, his associations, his late-night conversations. Pay attention to his temperament. I suspect duplicity, but I detest guessing. Saul tilted his head. You think Klein's behind it? I think, Wolfe said, that he is involved, either through commission or omission. The difference between guilt and stupidity is often measured in silence. Saul smiled faintly, understanding that this meant yes. Wolfe turned to me. Archie, you will revisit Mrs. Halpern tomorrow. We must know what her husband intended to achieve with this private sample. It was either a test of loyalty or a demonstration of deceit. Or a really bad hobby, I said. Piffle, he muttered. No man dies from curiosity alone. He dies from arrogance. We shall see which variety afflicted Mr. Halpern. Saul left with his assignment, promising to report by morning. Wolfe retreated into his mental sanctum while I handled the phone calls and paperwork. The brownstone settled into its usual evening rhythm, the faint hum of city traffic, the soft creak of wood, Fritz muttering operatically in the kitchen. If it hadn't been for the sealed jar in the refrigerator and the dead man behind it, you could have mistaken it for peace. The next morning, I paid a visit to the Halpern residence. The townhouse sat on a quiet stretch of East 68th, the kind of place where wealth is expressed through silence and expensive doorknobs. Lucinda Halpern received me in a sitting room that could have been lifted straight from a glossy magazine, tasteful, cold, and absolutely arranged. She was dressed in black, but not the kind that mourns. Her eyes were sharper than yesterday, and she greeted me with the faint, rehearsed smile of someone ready for interrogation. Mr. Goodwin, has Mr. Wolfe discovered something? Not yet, I said. But he's circling it, and when he circles long enough, something usually falls down the hole. I need to ask a few more questions about your husband's little experiment with the Mocha sample. Her gaze flicked toward the window. Yes, Daniel was testing a private blend. He said it would change everything. He didn't tell me what it was. Any idea where he got it? I assumed from his suppliers in Colombia, but now, she trailed off. He was secretive lately, paranoid even. He kept talking about someone sabotaging his shipments, undercutting his contracts. He thought one of his own people was involved. Did he name anyone? Only once. Edwin Klein. He said Edwin was hiding something. Financial irregularities, perhaps. But he wouldn't elaborate. That fit neatly with the growing shape of things, but neatness makes me suspicious. I changed tack. Mrs. Halpern, what did your husband do after he tested the sample? She thought for a moment. He said it wasn't quite right. Too bitter, too heavy. Then he sealed the tin from the plant and told me he'd send one to Mr. Wolfe as a control. He liked your employer's palate. Said Wolfe could detect deceit even in flavor. He's right about that, I said. Do you know where the jar he used went? No, I never saw it again. I looked around the room. On a nearby shelf sat a row of decorative jars, souvenirs from the company's coffee line, all carefully labeled. One, however, had a faint smudge on the glass, as if it had been wiped too quickly. Mind if I take a look at that? She hesitated, then nodded. The jar was empty, but faint traces of powder clung to the bottom. I took a handkerchief, dabbed a bit, and sealed it in an envelope. I'll have this checked, I said. Wolfe likes his evidence in portions small enough to digest intellectually. Lucinda folded her hands. Mr. Goodwin, you don't believe I poisoned my husband, do you? If I did, I'd be asking for your recipe, I said lightly. But no, Mrs. Halpin, I think you're as surprised as anyone. The question is whether someone meant for you to drink that cup. Her lips tightened. You think I was the target? I think Wolfe thinks that's possible. And when he starts thinking something's possible, the world tends to bend until it fits. She didn't answer, but her eyes dropped to the coffee service on the sideboard, untouched since the night before. The silence in the room was thick enough to stir with a spoon. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Saul had already returned. He was waiting in the office, his hat resting on his knee. Klein's been busy, he said when I came in. Met with a man named Rusk at the Elm Club last night. Rusk's a broker, deals in commodities, but he's been flagged for smuggling before. They argued for 15 minutes, then Klein left looking like someone had salted his fortune. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Excellent. Did they mention the company? Twice. Rusk said, if Halpern had signed, we'd both be rich. Klein told him to keep quiet before someone overheard. That is enough, Wolfe said. Archie, write a note to Inspector Kramer. Inform him that the death of Daniel Halpern was not accidental and that he is to come here at once with his forensic man. I raised an eyebrow. You planning to share credit this early? He closed his eyes. No. I'm planning to force his cooperation before he blunders into the evidence like a buffalo in a herb garden. An hour later, Kramer arrived, grumbling his way through the front door. He looked like a man dragged into confession. Wolfe, if this is another of your stunts... It is not, Wolfe said smoothly. It is a necessity. The poison was cyanide, yes, but its delivery was not through the public shipment. It was introduced to a separate sample, a blend that Mr. Halpin prepared himself. I believe he was deceived into using an additive from a rival source, one distributed by this man Rusk. Kramer blinked. Rusk? We've had our eye on him, smuggling unregistered agricultural chemicals. You think he slipped cyanide into the coffee? No, Wolfe said. I think he sold something that could have done so, perhaps an experimental preservative or flavoring. Halpin trusted him, tested it himself and paid for it. But the question is, who arranged the meeting? Who pushed him toward Rusk? I caught the look that passed between Wolfe and me. We both knew the answer, wore expensive suits, and hated surprises. Kramer grunted. You think Klein's involved? I think, Wolfe said, you will arrest him before dinner, and I will prove it before dessert. Kramer muttered something about miracles and red tape and stomped out, leaving the air smelling faintly of cigar and disbelief. When the door closed, Wolfe leaned back, folding his hands. Archie, I shall require the assistance of both Mr. Panzer and yourself tonight. There is a document missing, one that will confirm Klein's motive. He has concealed it at the factory, perhaps in his private office. We will retrieve it. You mean I'll retrieve it? I said. Precisely. You are the only one I trust to be both careful and insubordinate enough. He closed his eyes again. Do be thorough, Archie. Klein is a man who values control above all else. What he hides will not be obvious, But I assure you, once found, it will brew a confession even I could savor. So that's how I ended up planning a late-night stroll through a coffee factory with Saul Panzer as my silent partner and a murderer brewing in the background. Wolfe would stay at home, of course, commanding the play from his chair, immovable and inevitable. And as I buttoned my coat before heading out, I couldn't shake the feeling that the next thing found in that factory wouldn't just be a piece of paper. It might be the next body. The factory after hours was a different animal. Gone were the hum and hiss of machinery, the chatter of workers, and the scent of roasted beans thick enough to make you dizzy. What remained was the echo, every footstep multiplied, every door hinge whispered like a warning. Saul and I parked half a block away, in the kind of shadow that eats sound. The only light came from a weak bulb over the side entrance. "You sure about this?" Saul asked, adjusting the slim flashlight in his hand. "Sure enough," I said. "Wolfe thinks Klein left something here. Something he couldn't risk keeping at home. Documents, samples, a ledger, maybe even that Rusk connection. I just hope it's not buried under 50 pounds of Colombian roast." Saul's smile was quick, the kind of thing that didn't waste energy. "You take the office. I'll cover the floor. If anyone's watching, I'll see them first." I nodded and picked the lock on the side door, which was insultingly easy. We slipped inside, and the smell of coffee hit us again. Older now, musty, mixed with oil and paper dust. The place felt half asleep but restless, like it knew we weren't supposed to be there. The corridor to Klein's office was dim, lit only by the thin moonlight through the transom windows. His door was locked, but not secured enough to stop me. I'd learned a few tricks from my years as Wolfe's legman, mostly from having to open things other people swore were private. Inside the office was as neat as Klein's manners. The desk was clean, papers stacked in military order. There was a faint smell of cologne mixed with ink, the kind of man who wiped his fingerprints off the pen after signing his own name. I started with the desk drawers. Contracts, invoices, letters from distributors, all ordinary. But in the bottom drawer, behind a stack of export forms, I found a thin, leather-bound ledger with a red ribbon bookmark. No company title, no labels. I flipped it open. Inside were columns of numbers that didn't add up. Payments to a JR, EM, and Rusk. The last entry was dated the day before Halpern's death. Next to it, in Klein's careful handwriting, shipment confirmed, payment upon silence. That sounded promising enough to make my pulse pick up. I took out my notepad, jotted the key details, and then kept looking. Behind the desk was a steel cabinet with a combination lock. It wasn't heavy duty, probably meant for cash or private correspondence. I tried a few obvious guesses. Klein didn't strike me as the creative type, and on the third attempt, 1912, the founding year of the company, clicked it open. Inside were several folders marked South American Expansion and Private Contracts. Beneath those, sealed in a manila envelope, was a small glass jar, just like the one Dora Ellman had described. The label was faint, smudged, but still readable. Mocha Royale, Sample D. I pulled out my handkerchief, wrapped the jar carefully, and pocketed it. If Wolfe was right, this was the smoking gun, or the poisoned one. Just then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hall. I froze, listening. Saul was supposed to be outside. These steps were heavier, uneven, and definitely headed my way. I slipped behind the door, gun in hand, the safety off. The knob turned slowly. Light from a flashlight swept across the office, catching the edge of the desk. A figure stepped inside. It was Kerrigan, the line supervisor. His face looked strained, eyes darting like a man who expected ghosts. He went straight to the steel cabinet, crouched, and opened it. Same combination. He pulled out another envelope, thicker than the one I'd found. He opened it, glanced inside, and muttered, "It's gone. Damn it, he already took it." I stepped out from behind the door. "Looking for this?" He spun, startled, the flashlight jerking toward me. I kept my voice even. "Don't reach for anything, Kerrigan. I'd hate to ruin a good suit." He froze, staring at me like I'd grown horns. "Goodwin? What the hell are you doing here?" "Same as you, I imagine. Looking for what Klein didn't want found." His throat worked. "You don't understand. I thought he'd left it here." "It's being what, exactly?" He hesitated, then looked toward the door. "You shouldn't be here." "Neither should I." "That's probably true, but you first. What's in the envelope?" He swallowed hard. "Documents, payoffs. Klein's been using the South American contracts to launder money through Rusk's network. Halpern found out. That's why he was killed." That fit neatly enough to be dangerous. "And you?" I asked. "What's your role?" "I was supposed to sign off on shipments. I didn't know at first what it was for. When I realized, I tried to back out, but Klein said if I talked, I'd be next." There was fear in his eyes. Real fear, and it wasn't just of me. Before I could press further, Saul appeared in the doorway, silent as smoke. "We've got company," he said quietly. "Two men just pulled up in a sedan. One's Klein." I turned back to Kerrigan. "You're staying put. If you're smart, you'll let us handle this." He nodded weakly. Saul and I slipped into the hallway, taking positions on either side of the main entrance. Through the narrow glass, I saw Klein enter, followed by a man I didn't recognize. Shorter, stockier, with a scar running down his jaw. He carried himself like muscle, not management. They went straight toward the office. Saul and I moved fast, staying in the shadows. As they stepped inside, I heard Klein say, "Check the cabinet, if that ledger's gone." That was my cue. I flicked on my flashlight and stepped through the doorway. "Looking for your bedtime reading, Mr. Klein?" His head snapped up, and for a split second, his composure cracked. The man with him, Scarface, reached inside his coat, but Saul's gun was already leveled. "Don't," Saul said, softly enough to sound like a prayer. Klein recovered fast. "Goodwin, breaking and entering. You've overstepped your master's leash." "Maybe. But I found your little math problem in that ledger. Payment upon silence. That's not a company slogan, is it?" His eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Maybe not. But Wolfe will, once he sees this." I tapped my pocket. That did it. He lunged forward, fury replacing polish, but stopped cold when Saul's second gun appeared. His partner froze, breathing through his teeth. I kept my voice steady. "You're going to come with us, Mr. Klein. You can explain to Inspector Kramer how your business model includes cyanide samples and missing partners." Klein straightened his coat, his anger hardening into contempt. "You think you can frighten me? You're a messenger, Goodwin, nothing more." "Maybe, but tonight the message is you're done brewing poison." We marched them out without incident, Saul taking the rear. Kerrigan watched from the doorway, pale as the factory walls. He didn't say a word. By the time we reached the brownstone, it was past midnight. Wolfe was awake, sitting like a monarch awaiting tribute. When we entered, he looked at Klein, then at the jar in my hand. "Excellent," he said. "You've brought the disease and its symptom. Now, Mr. Klein, sit down." Klein sneered but obeyed. Wolfe gestured toward the jar. "This is what killed Daniel Halpern, an additive introduced under false pretense, sold to him by your associate Rusk. A preservative, yes, but tainted with cyanide. You arranged the transaction, knowing he would test it himself. It would appear accidental until you assumed control of the company." Klein's face tightened. "You can't prove that?" Wolfe's eyes half closed. "On the contrary, Mr. Goodwin discovered your ledger. The payments to Rusk, to Kerrigan, to others, all meticulously recorded. Even the note promising payment for silence. Your vanity betrayed you. Klein said nothing, but his pulse was visible at his temple, beating fast. Archie, Wolfe said, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him his arrest may proceed, and please inform him that coffee, like character, reveals its poison when brewed under pressure. I picked up the phone. Saul leaned against the wall, watching Klein's composure crumble inch by inch. Outside, dawn was pressing against the windows, gray and cold. As I spoke to Kramer, Wolfe sat back, satisfied, his eyes gleaming in the lamplight. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. He simply observed, the way a chess player watches the board after the final move. When I hung up, he sighed. Fritz will be relieved. The sanctity of the breakfast table is restored. I couldn't help smiling. And you? Satisfied? He lifted his cup, freshly brewed, perfectly balanced. Justice, Archie, is like good coffee. Bitter in preparation, but restorative once swallowed. And with that, he drank, while the city outside stirred awake, unaware that its most immovable detective had once again brewed up truth from a single poisoned cup. By the time Kramer arrived, the brownstone was lit like an interrogation stage. Fritz had been banished from the kitchen with a solemn promise that no one would touch the coffee urn until Wolfe declared it purified of all possible evil. Klein sat rigid in the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's desk, his face composed but his collar damp with the kind of sweat that can't be blamed on central heating. Saul lingered near the door, a silent insurance policy. Kramer came in with his usual storm of cigar smoke and skepticism. You know, Wolfe, one of these days, you'll lure me here at midnight and actually have nothing but indigestion to show for it. Inspector, Wolfe said evenly, your optimism flatters you. Kramer grunted, dropped into the nearest chair, and gave Klein a look that said he'd seen this species before and didn't like the breeding. All right, Wolfe. Make it simple. Why am I here instead of in bed? Because, Wolfe said, folding his hands, you now sit in the presence of a man who murdered his partner for profit and nearly extended that courtesy to his partner's wife. Klein made a dry, humorless sound. That's absurd. You have no proof. Wolfe tilted his head slightly. Proof, Mr. Klein, is a vulgar necessity. I prefer certainty, but since the inspector favors the former, I shall indulge him. He gestured toward the small glass jar on his desk, the same one I'd fished from Klein's cabinet. This, Inspector, is the key. A sample labeled Mocha Royale, Sample D. It contains trace elements of a cyanide compound introduced under the guise of a flavor-preserving additive. Mr. Halpin, trusting his partner, tested it himself. He was dead within the hour. Kramer leaned forward. And you're saying Klein here knew that? Of course, Wolfe said. He arranged for the additive through a third party, Mr. Rusk, a broker skilled in skirting legality. The payments to Rusk are documented in Klein's ledger, which Mr. Goodwin recovered from his office tonight. Each transaction corresponds to a date of shipment, culminating in the one marked payment upon silence. The silence, as it turned out, belonged to Mr. Halpin. Klein shifted in his seat. That's nonsense. Those payments were for experimental imports. Halpin approved everyone. Wolfe's voice remained mild, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Indeed. Until he learned the truth. He realized the additives were unlicensed chemicals that could spoil the company's reputation or kill its consumers. He confronted you. You persuaded him to test the latest batch himself, knowing it contained enough cyanide to kill him quietly. A convenient accident, and with his death, you would assume control of Halpin and Klein unchallenged. I watched Klein's composure start to crack. Not a collapse, but a slow crumbling, the kind that begins around the eyes. Kramer's tone hardened. And the coffee Wolfe and Halpin's wife got? Collateral, Wolfe said. a layer of confusion. If the tainted coffee reached both the critic and the widow, suspicion would scatter. A tragic contamination, nothing more. But Klein miscalculated. Mrs. Halpern sent her tin to me before tasting hers. My breakfast was spared only by chance. "Pfui," Klein snapped. "You're spinning fairy tales." Wolfe's eyes glinted. "If so, they are tales of arithmetic precision. Mr. Goodwin, the ledger." I handed it to Kramer, who flipped through the pages with a growing scowl. "Well, I'll be damned. Payments to Rusk, and a notation about Mocha D. That's our additive. And Kerrigan's name's in here too." "Kerrigan," Wolfe said, "was an unwitting accomplice. His signature authenticated the shipments, but he believed them to be harmless. When he discovered otherwise, Klein threatened him into silence. Had Mr. Goodwin not intercepted him at the factory tonight, he might now be as dead as his employer." Klein's mouth opened, then shut again. For a man who liked control, he'd just realized he was out of it. Kramer exhaled through his nose. "All right, I'll have Rusk picked up. Between the ledger, the jar, and Kerrigan's statement, the DA will have a field day. Congratulations, Wolfe. You've done it again." Wolfe inclined his head faintly. "The expression, Inspector, is, we have done it again. Mr. Goodwin risked bodily harm retrieving the evidence, and Mr. Panzer's observation provided the necessary corroboration. I merely arranged the pattern." Yeah, Kramer muttered, pocketing the ledger. "You arranged it. You always do." He turned to Klein. "You're coming with me. You have the right to keep your mouth shut, but I wouldn't count on it doing much good." Saul stepped aside as Kramer cuffed Klein, who didn't resist. His arrogance had burned out, leaving only something hollow and tight. As they left, the sound of the door closing behind them was softer than I expected, almost gentle. For a long minute, the brownstone was silent except for the clock ticking above Wolfe's desk. The case was finished, but the residue lingered like the bitterness of over-roasted beans. Wolfe finally spoke. "Archie, see that the jar is destroyed after Kramer has taken his samples, and instruct Fritz to brew fresh coffee. I wish to purge this odor of deceit from my house." "Right away," I said, "and if he asks whether to use the Mocha Royale blend—" "Archie," Wolfe interrupted, "do not attempt levity. I'm not amused." Which, of course, meant he was, at least a little. While Fritz prepared the sanctified brew, Wolfe settled back in his chair, eyes half closed, the immense machinery of his mind already winding down. He looked content, not pleased, not triumphant, but at ease, like a man who had restored a world that had briefly tilted off its axis. "You know," I said after a while, "most people would have taken it personally that someone tried to poison them. You treated it like a crossword puzzle." He opened one eye. "Emotion clouds logic. I prefer clarity. Besides, the true offense was not the attempt on my life. It was the desecration of coffee." "Glad to see your priorities are intact," I said. "Of course they are," he replied. "When a man tampers with what he does not understand, he invites his own destruction. Halpern was careless with trust. Klein was careless with intellect. Both paid." Fritz reappeared then, carrying a tray with 2 cups. The aroma filled the room, dark, rich, alive. Wolfe inhaled deeply, almost reverently. He took 1 sip and nodded. Restored, I leaned back in my chair. "So, what happens to Mrs. Halpern?" "She inherits her husband's shares," Wolfe said. "The company will endure. Whether she learns restraint from this experience is uncertain. Human appetites seldom reform." That's a cheerful note to end on. He gave a small, satisfied grunt. "Life, Archie, is an endless cycle of indulgence and consequence. My only concern is maintaining the balance." He lifted his cup again, studying the dark liquid as though it held the secret of civilization itself. "And now, if you please, no further talk of crime until morning. I wish to dine in peace." Fritz announced that dinner would be braised duck with juniper sauce. Wolfe's expression softened into something dangerously close to bliss. I watched him settle back, serene, immense, untouchable. Outside, the city murmured its sleepless tune, but inside the brownstone, order had been restored, one poisoned cup at a time. When I finally rose to leave him to his feast, he called after me, "Archie." "Yeah? Remind me tomorrow to compose a letter to the importers. I intend to suggest a new label for their product line." "Oh? What's that?" He gave me a slow, sardonic smile. "Mocha fatalis. It will sell brilliantly among fools." I laughed, shook my head, and closed the door behind me, leaving him alone with his triumph, his duck, and his perfectly safe cup of coffee. Morning slid into the brownstone like it was apologizing for disturbing the peace. The smell of Fritz's freshly baked corn muffins floated through the air, followed closely by the quiet rhythm of Wolfe's orchids breathing in their own greenhouse luxury. For most people, that would have been serenity. For me, it was the calm before Wolfe decided to ruin it with one of his afterthoughts, which were never after or thoughts. They were detonations with timing. He appeared in the office at exactly 9:45, moving slower than justice, but twice as certain. I was at my desk, finishing a report Kramer had demanded, for his official records, which meant he'd probably lose it in a drawer and blame me 6 months from now. Wolfe grunted and lowered himself into his chair with the grace of a collapsing cathedral. "Archie," he said, "I've been considering Klein's confession." I looked up. "He didn't confess. He was dragged. You're just spoiled because they usually fold in your office." He gave me a sidelong glance. His manner of capitulation was irrelevant. The man lied by omission even as he spoke the truth. "There remains a fissure." I leaned back. "A fissure?" "Yes," he said, "between motive and opportunity. Klein killed Halpern, yes, but not out of mere greed. He was not in financial peril. His accounts reveal solvency. He risked exposure for something more than profit. That was Wolfe for you. Solving a case wasn't enough. He had to exhume its moral autopsy." "So you're saying there's a chapter missing?" I said. "Precisely. And the missing chapter may contain another author." That woke me up. "You mean an accomplice? Or an instigator?" "Perhaps both." The phone rang, slicing the air. I picked it up. It was Saul Panzer. "Morning, Archie. I just got word. Rusk's dead." That got Wolfe's eyes open a full inch, which for him was practically a standing ovation. "Explain," he said when I relayed the message. "Found in his apartment," Saul continued. "Gas leak, according to the uniforms. But the stove was off and the window nailed shut. Somebody wanted it to look accidental." I whistled. "Neat work." "Too neat," Saul said. "Want me to dig deeper?" "Not yet," Wolfe interrupted, his tone cutting clean through the receiver. "Do nothing until I summon you. You will, however, remain available." When I hung up, he was staring at the carpet as if it had committed a personal affront. "Rusk's death," he murmured, "alters the pattern. Either he silenced himself to spare his client, or he was silenced by another hand altogether." "Which brings us back to your missing author," I said. "Indeed. And the script is tightening. Archie, bring Mrs. Halpern here at noon. I wish to speak with her again." She arrived punctual as a banker, dressed in grey this time. Subdued, deliberate. There was less shock in her face, more calculation. I ushered her into the office where Wolfe sat, immovable as fate. "Mrs. Halpern," he began, "your husband's partner has confessed. The man responsible for Daniel's death is in custody." Her hands twitched slightly in her lap. "Then it's finished." Wolfe's voice was soft. "No. It is resolved, but not finished. You see, Mrs. Halpern, I detest incomplete things. There remains an inconsistency, why your husband's sample, not the general batch, was poisoned. For Klein's plan, it was too personal." She frowned. "He wanted to make it look accidental." Possibly. But then why involve me? Why risk sending the same tainted batch to my home? That added complexity, exposure, danger. It does not align with Klein's temperament. Her eyes flicked toward me, then back to Wolfe. What are you implying? That he was not the only one invested in Daniel's death. The silence that followed was thick enough to drink. She stood abruptly. Mr. Wolfe, that's outrageous. You said yourself the evidence. Evidence, Wolfe said, cutting her off like a guillotine, proves the act, not the impulse. You benefited from your husband's death, did you not? I inherited his shares, she snapped. Indeed. And now you control the company, free from his meddling or his increasingly erratic decisions. Convenient, is it not? Her voice sharpened. You think I killed him? I think, Wolfe said calmly, you understood that Klein would. You may have even encouraged him. Two ambitious minds, united briefly by mutual inconvenience. She stared at him, the color draining from her face. That's absurd. I despised Klein. Emotion, Wolfe murmured, is no barrier to collaboration. In fact, it often oils the hinge. You sent the poisoned batch to me, Mrs. Halpin, to ensure that when the deaths occurred, suspicion would scatter between business rivalry and happenstance, the perfect camouflage. I watched her composure flicker, just a tremor at the corner of her mouth. She recovered fast. You can't prove that. Perhaps not to the court, Wolfe said, but I can prove it to you. He gestured to me. Archie, the phone call from Rusk's landlord. Repeat it. I caught on. Landlord said a woman came by Rusk's place yesterday morning. Elegant, well-spoken, left an envelope. He couldn't recall her face, but remembered her perfume. Something floral and rare. Sound familiar, Mrs. Halpern? Her eyes widened before she caught herself. You're lying. Wolfe leaned forward slightly, and when Nero Wolfe leans, the world tilts. No, madam. You bribed Rusk to keep quiet. But when you learned Klein had been arrested, you feared Rusk might bargain for leniency. So you silenced him with gas. How fitting for a woman who nearly poisoned her own husband. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You have no proof. On the contrary, Wolfe said, gesturing toward the small glass jar still on his desk. Your fingerprints are on that jar. You handled it when you brought it to me as a gift from your husband. The police found identical prints at Rusk's apartment. On the window latch, he could not have touched himself. Her breath hitched. Then, like a marionette whose strings had been cut, she sank back into the chair. For a moment, she didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, eerie in its acceptance. Daniel was going to destroy everything. Years of work. He called me reckless, said I didn't understand business. I built that company as much as he did. He didn't. Deserved to ruin it. Klein agreed? Wolfe asked. She nodded slowly. He thought he could handle it. Make it look like an accident. I didn't think it would go this far. Yet it did, Wolfe said softly. And now it ends where it began, with deceit brewed to perfection. I called Kramer. He didn't bother hiding his astonishment. Twice in 2 days. What's the brownstone running, Wolfe? A revolving door for murderers. I prefer to think of it as a crucible, Wolfe replied. Impurities rise under heat. When the inspector arrived to take her away, she didn't fight, just looked once around the office. At Wolfe, at me, at the coffee service she'd once poisoned, and smiled faintly, like she'd almost admire the artistry of her own undoing. After she was gone, Wolfe sighed, long and low. Women, Archie, possess infinite courage and limited prudence, an unfortunate combination. I said nothing, just poured us both a cup. The coffee was dark, strong, flawless. Do you ever get tired, I asked, of being right? He lifted his cup, eyes closing in satisfaction. Frequently. But fortunately, human folly renews itself daily. That was Wolfe. never sentimental, always precise. The case was over, justice served, and breakfast restored to its rightful sanctity. Outside, the October light was turning gold, and the world kept spinning. None the wiser that a single poisoned cup had brewed a confession, a downfall, and, as always, one more small triumph for Nero Wolfe. By evening, the brownstone had settled back into its rhythm, quiet, measured, and smugly civilized. Fritz had forgiven the universe for nearly poisoning his kitchen. Wolfe had retreated into the orchid rooms for his daily communion, and I was left at my desk trying to make sense of the paperwork Kramer's men had scattered over the day. Outside, the light had turned to that bruised gray that hangs between afternoon and night, when even New York holds its breath for a second before starting the next round of noise. I'd almost convinced myself the case was wrapped. Klein was in custody, Mrs. Halpern was on her way to the tombs, and Kramer had left grumbling something that sounded like gratitude. It should have been the neat finish Wolfe liked, a perfect balance of motive, method, and moral conclusion. But something about the way Wolfe had watched her go lingered in my head. He'd looked satisfied, yes, but not settled, like a man who had solved the puzzle but didn't trust the picture on the box. When he finally emerged from the plant rooms, he moved slower than usual, his hands clasped behind him, his expression halfway between reflection and irritation. He paused at his desk and looked at me. "Archie," he said, "have you ever noticed that people rarely kill for what they claim to kill for?" I leaned back. "Sure, they say it's for love or money, but usually it's about pride, vanity, or some grievance from 1932. He nodded once. "Precisely. Klein killed Halpern because he was manipulated into doing so. Mrs. Halpern's vanity fueled the manipulation, but not the origin. The inception of the idea was too refined, too deliberate. She was clever, but not calculating enough to design the mechanism of her husband's death and its camouflage in one stroke." "Then who was?" I asked. "Don't tell me we're collecting murderers by the dozen." He turned his head slightly toward the window, where the streetlights were beginning to bloom against the dusk. "We are missing a hand that shaped both Klein and Lucinda. Someone who understood their ambitions and played them like complementary instruments." I frowned. "You think there's a third player?" "I'm certain of it," he said. "Rusk was the tool, not the mind. He had neither subtlety nor reach. Someone else directed the symphony. Someone who benefited from both deaths." It took a second before it hit me. "You mean someone inside the company?" Wolfe's eyes half closed. "Or adjacent to it. You will recall the name of the quality tester, Miss Dora Ellman." I blinked. "The lab girl? She's the only one who came out of this looking clean." "Which makes her suspect," he said. "You told me she saw Mr. Halpern test the private sample and noted that the jar differed from their usual stock. How, I wonder, did she know what that jar contained if it bore no label? And why did she recall it so clearly after only a brief encounter?" "She was observant," I said, though it sounded weak even to me. "She was rehearsed," Wolfe corrected. "She wanted you to remember her story. The fact that she was the one who witnessed both Halpern and Klein together during their final argument suggests she was already inserting herself into the narrative." I rubbed my temples. "If you're right, that makes her the one who slipped the additive to Halpern in the first place." "Exactly," Wolfe said. "She was the bridge between the experiment and the fatality. And when the collapse occurred, she remained standing, innocent, invisible, indispensable. A perfect architect." I picked up the phone. "You want me to bring her in?" He shook his head. "No, that would warn her. She will come here of her own accord. She must believe she is safe, and she will until I remind her otherwise." He was right as usual. Around 8, the doorbell rang. Fritz announced her politely with the same tone he used for the tax collector. Dora Ellman stepped into the office, wearing a modest navy suit and carrying a small leather bag. Her manner was calm, composed, and very aware. She glanced at me, then at Wolfe, and smiled faintly. "Mr. Wolfe, I wanted to thank you," she said. "The news said you caught them, Mr. Klein and Mrs. Halpern. I thought you'd like to know that everyone at the plant is relieved." Wolfe inclined his head slightly. "Indeed. Relief is a fragile thing, Miss Elman. Sit down." She obeyed, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I noticed she didn't set down the bag. Wolfe regarded her in silence for a full 10 seconds. Then, "Tell me, Miss Elman, how long have you worked for Halpern and Klein?" 3 years, she said. "I started as an assistant chemist." "And during that time, did you ever feel undervalued?" Her eyes flicked up, quick and sharp. "Everyone feels that sometimes." "Yes," he said, "but not everyone rearranges the hierarchy with poison." Her face didn't move, but her pulse betrayed her, a small flicker at the base of her throat. "I don't know what you mean." Wolfe gestured to the small glass jar still sitting on the corner of his desk. "This began in your lab, did it not? You developed a preservative blend designed to stabilize flavor oils during transport. Mr. Halpern dismissed it as unstable. Too bitter, he said. You resented that dismissal, particularly when he credited Klein with securing a safer import substitute. You saw an opportunity for vindication." Her voice was low, tense. "You have no proof of that." "Proof is redundant when one understands behavior," Wolfe said. "You replaced the sample in Halpern's private jar with your own formulation, ensuring it would fail spectacularly. You expected it to cause embarrassment, perhaps a mild illness. But when Halpern died, you saw something better. Chaos. 2 partners at odds, one dead, the other desperate. And you used that chaos to shift suspicion. You fed Mr. Goodwin your story about the jar, ensuring we looked at Klein and Mrs. Halpern instead of you." She stared at him, color draining from her face. "You're guessing." "Deduction is never guessing," he said. "You came here tonight to confirm whether your diversion had succeeded. It did. Until now." Her fingers tightened on the bag. "You can't prove it." I saw the movement before Wolfe did. She opened the clasp, her hand darting inside. I was already up, grabbing her wrist before she could pull whatever was hidden there. The bag fell to the carpet, spilling a small vial that rolled to a stop near Wolfe's foot. It was labeled simply Sample E. I picked it up. "Guessing, huh?" Her shoulders slumped. "It was supposed to be different," she said quietly. "I just wanted them to notice. They laughed at me, called me a child with a chemistry set." Wolfe's expression was unreadable, but there was something like pity buried deep behind his eyes. "You sought acknowledgement through destruction. That is the most primitive form of creation, Miss Elman." When Kramer came back, he looked like he'd aged another 5 years. "Another one? For God's sake, Wolfe, are you running a confession factory now?" Wolfe didn't answer. He only gestured toward the vial. "Handle that with care, Inspector. It is ambition distilled." When the door closed behind them, I sat back down. "You ever think of installing a revolving door for the guilty?" Wolfe snorted softly. "No. I prefer they enter once at the proper time and leave never of their own accord." He poured the last of the evening's coffee, and the smell filled the room again. Clean, pure, final. "Archie," he said, "you may note this as an addendum to the case file. Vanity killed Halpern, greed consumed Klein, and pride condemned Miss Elman. 3 poisons, 1 cup." I nodded. "And you cured it with caffeine." He looked almost amused. "Not caffeine, Archie. Clarity. The rarer stimulant." I left him there, the lamplight glinting off his glass as he raised it in silent salute to no one in particular. Outside, the night had deepened, and the city's pulse had settled into its usual beat. Inside, the brownstone exhaled its contentment again, its silence restored, its master appeased. And me? I knew tomorrow morning the case would be reduced to a single file on a shelf. But for now, as Fritz brought in the last tray and Wolfe took his final sip, it felt like balance had been restored to the only world that mattered. Wolfe's world, where logic ruled, appetite was law, and even murder, once solved, could end with the taste of peace in a Mocha cup. The following morning started like every other in the brownstone. Wolfe silent, the world obedient. I was halfway through buttering my toast when he emerged from the plant rooms, still wrapped in that dense calm that meant his mind hadn't stopped working since the night before. He didn't look tired, just slower, like he'd been pruning his thoughts as carefully as his orchids. "Archie," he said, lowering himself into his chair, "I find myself reflecting on a paradox." I poured his coffee and waited. With Wolfe, paradoxes were just breakfast with extra seasoning. 3 people conspired toward one death, he continued. Each believed they were acting independently, yet all were bound by the same thread. Self-deception. Klein by pride, Mrs. Halpern by resentment, Miss Ellman by wounded vanity. None of them understood the enormity of their own pettiness. It was almost banal. "Banal murder sells papers," I said, "and keeps us in business." He grunted. "I am not a tradesman of tragedy. I am an observer of folly." He sipped the coffee, then frowned. "This brew, Archie, is unbalanced. You have altered the ratio." "I measured it to the grain," I said. "Then your scale lies." I watched him taste again, and a small part of me smiled. There it was. The old Wolfe, irritated by imperfection. The brownstone was breathing again. We finished breakfast in silence. Outside, rain had started to fall, tapping the windows like impatient fingers. The world felt washed, but not clean. Around 10, the doorbell rang. Fritz answered and returned a minute later. "Inspector Kramer, Mr. Wolfe, and he is not in a good humor." "He rarely is," Wolfe said, but his voice carried a note of curiosity. "Show him in." Kramer stomped in, damp trench coat, cigar lit like a flare. "I hope you're proud of yourself, Wolfe." "That depends entirely on why," Wolfe said mildly. Kramer dropped a folder on the desk. "Because your Miss Ellman sang half the night, and every note of it makes the DA happy. But now the press has it. Some bright reporter dug through the records and found she'd applied for a patent on that additive 2 months ago. They're calling her a poison prodigy. You can imagine how that's playing in the morning edition." I reached for the folder, but Wolfe lifted a hand. "Leave it, Archie." His gaze stayed on Kramer. "Public sensation is your department, Inspector, not mine." "Don't get smug," Kramer said. "This circus started because you let her come here. If she hadn't cracked in your office, we'd still be building a clean case against Klein, Halpern's widow. Now we've got 3 defendants, 2 plea deals, and a defense lawyer who smells like opportunity." Wolfe's lip curled faintly. "You object to justice because it arrived untidily." "I object," Kramer growled, "to the idea that every time someone in this city drops dead, you turn it into a philosophical exercise. The DA wants the story buried before every import company in the state starts dumping their inventory." "Then bury it," Wolfe said simply. "But not here." Kramer stared at him for a moment, then exhaled heavily, the smoke curling like exasperation made visible. "You always think you're above it, don't you?" "No," Wolfe said. "I merely prefer to stand aside while others sink." Kramer glared, grabbed his folder, and left without another word. The door shut with finality, leaving behind the faint odor of wet wool and official indignation. Wolfe didn't speak for a while. He just sat there, tapping one finger against the arm of his chair, his mind clearly walking through invisible corridors. Finally, he said, "Archie, summon Saul." "Already? You planning an encore?" "Not an encore, a verification." By noon, Saul was in the office, looking like a man who'd already seen the punchline but hadn't decided whether to laugh. "You want me to check the patent office, right?" he asked. "Among other things." Wolfe said. Confirm the applicant's sponsors. If Miss Ellman submitted her work for review, she did not do so alone. Someone financed her, guided her, perhaps even nudged her toward vengeance. You think there's another shadow behind her? I asked. That's getting crowded for one murder. Not another killer, Wolfe said. A catalyst, an intellectual parasite. Someone who recognized her grievance and supplied the means to exploit it. There is sophistication in her formula that exceeds her training. She may have brewed the poison, but the recipe was not hers. Saul nodded once. Got it. I'll trace the application and cross-check her financials. If someone bankrolled her, it'll leave a footprint. He left without fanfare. Saul never wasted an exit. Wolfe leaned back, eyes closing halfway. This, Archie, is what truly offends me, he said after a while. The idea that intelligence can be corrupted so easily. Miss Ellman's invention had legitimate potential. Properly refined, it might have revolutionized preservation. Instead, it became an instrument of vanity. I smirked. You're sympathizing with a murderer now. I'm sympathizing, he said dryly, with wasted intellect. By 5, Saul called back. His voice was crisp. You were right, Wolfe. The patent wasn't filed by her alone. It lists a co-sponsor, Dr. Leonard Stegman, chemical consultant, freelance researcher. Used to work for the Department of Agriculture until he was let go for falsifying safety data. Guess where he's been consulting the last year? Halpin and Klein Imports. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, bright and cold. Find him. Already tried. Apartment's empty. Landlord says he left town 2 days ago, left behind an unpaid tab and a stack of lab notes. Fetch them, Wolfe ordered. When Saul arrived later that night, the rain had thickened into a downpour. He handed Wolfe a folder, damp at the edges, full of scrawled formulas, shipping manifests, and what looked like correspondence in 2 distinct handwritings. Wolfe examined it in silence, his lips tightening with each page. Archie, he said finally. This man, Stegman, orchestrated everything. He courted Miss Ellman's resentment, refined her additive into a poison, and used her to test it on Halpin. When it succeeded, he planned to patent it under his own name through her proxy. But Klein's panic and Halpin's death accelerated the unraveling. When she realized she'd been used, she silenced him, or tried to. He vanished instead. Which means he's still out there, I said. Yes, Wolfe murmured. And unlike the others, he possesses intellect unburdened by conscience, a most noxious species. I frowned. So what now? He looked up, and for a moment his eyes had that rare, dangerous gleam. Now, we finish the brew. I will find him without leaving this chair. I didn't ask how. I'd seen it before, the stillness that meant he was rearranging the universe in his mind. The room felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were leaning in to listen. Fritz brought coffee. Saul disappeared into the rain, and I sat there, watching Wolfe think, knowing that somewhere out there, a man who'd poisoned an empire's worth of trust was already being hunted by an intellect larger than his own. The storm outside deepened, the city swallowing its own echoes. And in that quiet, broken only by the faint clink of a cup on porcelain, I knew the case wasn't finished at all. It had only settled, waiting for Wolfe to stir it again the way he always did, until the last secret floated to the top. It was 3 days before Wolfe spoke of the case again. Not that silence in the brownstone was unusual. It was his default setting, and mine when the dust settled. But this particular quiet had weight. Saul had tracked Stegman to Newark, where he'd boarded a freighter bound for Buenos Aires under a borrowed name. Kramer's men had missed him by an hour, which to Kramer was personal injury. To Wolfe, it was inevitability. By the 4th morning, routine reasserted itself. The orchids reclaimed his mornings. The world outside could rot. Fritz recovered his good humor, humming Wagner in the kitchen like the restored high priest of domestic order. I was halfway through the paper, reading the inevitable column about the Mocha murders, when Wolfe rang the office buzzer. He was at his desk when I entered, surrounded by the faint perfume of the orchids and the sharper scent of newly brewed coffee. There was no case folder this time, no witness trembling in a chair. Just Wolfe, serene as a Buddha who had discovered cynicism firsthand. "Archie," he said, "has the world resumed its idiocy?" "Still on schedule," I said. Kramer's quoted in 3 papers. They're calling Miss Elman a tragic genius and Klein a victim of corporate greed. He grunted. Journalists, the high priests of distortion, to them a lie merely requires an audience. "Maybe, but you got your share of ink too," I said, flipping the paper open. "Private Detective Nero Wolfe cracks poison plot. There's even a sketch of you." He glanced at it, grimaced. "It makes me look awake." "You were," I said, "for a while." That earned the faintest twitch of his mouth, Wolfe's equivalent of a belly laugh. He gestured for me to sit. "Stegman," he said, "will not remain at liberty. His arrogance will undo him. Intellect without discipline always does. I have already notified an associate in Buenos Aires. It is only a matter of time." I leaned back. "So, the final domino falls. What then? You get back to your orchids, I type up a report Kramer won't read, and Fritz declares peace restored to the pantry." "That," Wolfe said, "is civilization, Archie. Temporary equilibrium after recurrent barbarity." "Sounds cheerful," I said. "Remind me to embroider it on a pillow." He ignored me, staring at the thin tendril of steam rising from his cup. There is, however, a melancholy to it. Each of these people, Halpin, Klein, Miss Elman, imagined themselves singular. Yet they were interchangeable in their self-importance. They believed the world owed them acknowledgement, and when it did not, they reached for deceit. "Which worked until you decided to ruin it," I said. He inclined his head slightly. "I did not ruin it, Archie. I revealed it. The truth was there, waiting. It always is. Human frailty simply provides the scaffolding." That was Wolfe in a nutshell, part philosopher, part bulldozer. Fritz appeared then, carrying a tray with a covered dish. "Lunch, Mr. Wolfe," he said, in the tone of a man presenting communion. "Ah," Wolfe murmured, relief at last. Fritz lifted the lid. Trout soufflé with a light cream reduction. Wolfe inhaled deeply, eyes half closing in reverence. Perfection. "Archie, pour the beer." I obeyed, and for a while we ate in peace. Outside, the rain had eased into a whisper against the windows. It was one of those moments that made the brownstone feel like a fortress, the city beyond it just a rumor. When he finished, Wolfe wiped his mouth and leaned back, regarding me with that distant appraisal that usually meant he was about to say something I wouldn't like. "You realize," he said, "this case was nearly a personal insult. Because they tried to kill you." "No, because they did it with bad coffee." I grinned. "You're still holding that grudge?" He lifted a finger. "Archie, coffee is a sacrament. To tamper with it is heresy. To use it as a medium for murder is blasphemy. Were it not for the constraints of the law, I might have strangled Klein myself." "Good thing you stick to verbal executions," I said. "Words, used properly," he said, "are more fatal." I didn't argue. He'd proved that enough times. After lunch, Fritz cleared the tray and the room settled into its usual rhythm. The tick of the wall clock, the faint hum of the city, the sound of Wolfe's chair creaking as he shifted his massive frame into repose. I turned back to the typewriter, finishing the last paragraph of my report. Wolfe had told me once that all stories end in paperwork or silence. In our line, we usually got both. Around 3, the phone rang. It was Kramer again, sounding as though he'd just swallowed sandpaper. "Wolfe," he said, "your man Stegman got himself picked up at the port in Buenos Aires. Passport, ticket and a suitcase full of lab samples. The locals are holding him. Thought you'd like to know. Wolfe's reply was calm. I'm gratified. Ensure the Department of Justice forwards the necessary extradition requests. I should like to see him face the justice he so assiduously evaded. Kramer grumbled. You'll see it all right. You always do. I don't know how, but you always do. He hung up. Wolfe leaned back, closing his eyes. There, Archie, he said. Order restored. The world limps on, minus one more fool. I watched him for a moment. You ever get tired of winning? He cracked an eyelid. I am perpetually tired, but not of winning. I laughed and reached for my coat. I'm going out. The world may be limping, but some of us still have to walk in it. Do not be long, he said. Dinner at 7. Fritz is preparing squab. I'll try to survive till then. When I came back an hour later, Wolfe was where I'd left him, as if time itself had paused in his office. The rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp and clean. He looked up from the book he was pretending to read. Archie, he said, you will file this case under human frailty, cumulative. Subfolder of idiots with coffee, I assume. He allowed himself a small smile. As you wish. I sat down, lighting a cigarette. The smoke curled toward the ceiling, lazy and blue. Funny thing, boss, I said. Every one of them thought they were fixing something, improving their lot, proving themselves. And they all ended up either dead or caged. You ever wonder why people can't leave good enough alone? He looked at me for a long moment. Because, Archie, contentment is a discipline, not a gift. Most men are too lazy to learn it. That was Wolfe, half sermon, half scalpel. I nodded. Maybe, but I'll take my version. Paychecks, decent food, and a front row seat when you peel back the world's nonsense. He closed his book. A modest philosophy, perhaps even a sound one. The clock struck 7. Fritz's voice floated from the dining room announcing dinner. Wolfe rose, slowly, deliberately, as though the earth itself had shifted to accommodate him. He paused at the doorway, looking back toward the desk, where the faint trace of coffee still lingered in the air. Archie, he said, you may inform the grocer tomorrow that we require a new shipment of Mocha, but this time from Ceylon. I've had enough of Colombia for a lifetime. Got it, I said. And if anyone offers it as a gift? He gave a soft snort. Decline it. Gifts, like coffee, are rarely pure. He left for dinner, the house absorbing him the way it always did. I sat there a while longer, the last of the day fading through the windows. Another case done, another moral dissected. And somewhere between the taste of coffee and the echo of Wolfe's voice, I realized he was right. About contentment, about deceit, about everything. The world outside would keep on brewing its troubles, bitter and dark. But inside the brownstone, under the hum of its steady order, justice had once again been served. Hot, exact, and perfectly measured. And if you ask me, it even smelled like victory, 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 smelled like victory.